Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Migration Studies webinar entitled Migration Realities in the United States, looking at causes, trends, and solutions. My name is Mario Russell, and I'm the Executive Director of CMS, Center for Migration Studies. We are an educational, research, and policy organization that brings person-centered and community-focused, fact-based analysis on international and domestic matters of migration. And we've been providing these services since 1964, marking this as our 60th year anniversary. With a tense US election ahead of us, in which migration plays a central role, with the degradation of public discourse on migration in the making over the past 15 or more years, and with the arrival of many new migrants seeking protection and opportunity in the last 3 years, today's webinar is timely. It is designed to provide a general overview of the current migration landscape in the United States with an attempt to frame the major incandescent, if you will, issues of the moment, if not perhaps just to place them in perspective. This webinar was originally conceived as a context-setting presentation for the CMS Immigrant Integration Convening, which will be held at St. John's University in Queens, New York on Thursday of next week, September 12th. But we thought this topic was important enough to bring it forward more broadly. We're very excited about the September 12th convening and encourage you to attend. Julie, our communications manager, will drop some information in the chat. But today I'm extremely excited to hear from 4 experts who will address migration from select sociological, demographic, resettlement, legal, and policy perspectives. They will speak to the causes and the root causes of migration, the issues and opportunities raised by border narratives and politics, the successes and challenges of refugee protection and resettlement, recent demographic changes and trends in migration, and the legal and policy realities, shortcomings, and frankly, potential and constructive ways forward. We have 4 terrific speakers, as I said, each of whom will present for about 7 or 8 minutes. And once they're done, we will open up the floor to your questions, which you should put into the Q&A. The questions are visible to us and the panelists only, so don't worry if you don't see your question unless it is answered online. I will, though, read the question and direct them for response and discussion as appropriate. And your submission, if you would kindly identify who you are and the organization you work for, that would be great. So let me now just briefly introduce our speakers. First, we will hear from David Cronin. David is Senior Policy and Legislative Specialist at Catholic Relief Services. David works with Congress and the administration to advance CRS's public policy and advocacy efforts related to a number of areas and issues: foreign assistance appropriations, vulnerable people on the move, Latin America and the Caribbean, and locally led development and humanitarian responses. Here, David will examine the causes, root, and other of migration within this hemisphere, and will address or at least try to, misperceptions that inhibit the making of good policy. We will then hear from Julie McPherson, who is the Executive Director of the Global Campaign for Education, and until very recently, though, was Vice President of Advocacy and Operations at Jesuit Refugee Services in the United States, a position that she held for many years. There, she oversaw JRS's USA Advocacy and Outreach Program and managed all of the USA program's internal operations for a team of about 45 staff. Today, Julia will speak about the current state of the US refugee program, the challenges and opportunities it has experienced in recent time as a result of significant administrative cutbacks. She'll look at the parallel models of resettlement and protection that have developed over the years recently. Consider people fleeing Ukraine, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Cuba, Haiti, and more, and how these programs play into the policy and perceptions about migrants, about the border, and about ultimately, again, the broader narrative. Next, we'll hear from Mark Hugo Lopez. Mark is Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the Pew Research Center, where he leads planning of the center's research agenda focused on chronicling the diverse, always changing racial and ethnic landscape of the United States. He is an expert on issues of racial and ethnic identity, Latino politics and culture, the US Hispanic and Asian American populations, global and domestic immigration, and the US demographic landscape. Mark was previously the Center's Director of Global Migration and Demography and of Hispanic Research. He'll speak today on no insignificant topic, demographics, composition, and perceptions of immigrants in the US today. And we'll try to address sort of what the data shows about migration, touch on related cultural issues and the resulting 2024 election implications, US public opinion, the undocumented, and more. Again, no small feat in 8 minutes. And finally, we'll hear from Muzaffar Chishti. Muzaffar is a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, MPI, and director of MPI's office at the New York University School of Law. And prior to joining MPI, Mus was director of the Immigration Project of the Union of Needle Trades, known as Unite. He's a colleague and active change maker on many fronts of the immigration story in the United States over the past 30 plus years. He's a thought leader in the field, advising administrations, Congress, and the public. Muzaffar will speak today and gratefully achieve for us a simple objective, of which he's been tasked, which is tying together everything that will have been said earlier today and offer up some solutions. Namely, what are the right, reasonable, just, and efficient solutions, ways forward with respect to immigration policy? What are our options and hopes, particularly in light of the last 3 years, particularly in light of public discourse, and particularly in light of a structurally frozen Congress? I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think it is very important that, in fact, we maintain an aspirational sense, though reality might cut against the grain. So again, I thank you all for joining. I'm delighted to have you speakers here today and joining in this discussion. I turn it over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario, and good afternoon, everyone. Really great to be with you. So as Mario said, I'm with Catholic Relief Services. We are the international relief and development agency of the Catholic community in the United States. For those unfamiliar with us, we operate in about a little over 100 countries around the world. And last year, we served more than 200 million people. Now, I'll start my comments today with kind of a framing point. And that is that when I think a lot of us think about migration, the first thing that we think about is the border. Now, at CRS, we try to get people to think and to look beyond the border. Now, when I think and look beyond the border, one of the first things I think about is a poem called Home by Warsan Shire that starts with the line, "No one leaves home unless your home is the mouth of a shark." I'll say that again. No one leaves home unless your home is the mouth of a shark. So before we can think about welcoming, protecting, promoting, integrating migrants in the United States, it's really important for us to ask who is coming, why are people migrating, and what can we do as an organization like Catholic Relief Services, as a US government, as people, to support people to have opportunities to live and thrive in their home communities, should they want to do that. So first, who is migrating? This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but from the policy perspective and where I sit, 20 years ago, a lot of the conversation was about US-Mexico migration and Mexican migration. About 10 years ago, we talked more about Central American migration and this uptick of migrants coming from the northern countries of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Today, we talk about hemispheric-wide migration. Haiti, other Caribbean nations, Venezuela, other South American nations, in addition to Central American countries and Mexico. So the parameters of this conversation have expanded from one of neighbors to region to hemisphere. So that second question I ask, why are people migrating? I think a lot of times we think about push factors, we think about pull factors. I'm going to focus on the push factors. Now, push factors, they may seem simple at first. You may think that there's only one reason why someone migrates, but the push factors are complex, they are layered, they are nuanced, they are personal, and they can take months, years, even decades to kind of cultivate in someone's eventual decision to migrate. So we can think about political crises in Haiti and Venezuela. We can think about violence in the northern countries of Central America. We can think about the lack of economic opportunity or food insecurity that exists in certain parts of the hemisphere. And we can also think about the impacts of climate change, specifically in the dry corridor of Central America that are driving migration. All of these factors are at play as we think about the push factors today for migration. Now, what do organizations like CRS do? Well, when we think about push factors, we actually like to talk about stay factors. What are the things that can promote rootedness in a community? What are things that can promote someone's own opportunity to live and thrive in their home? So the first thing that we do is, in times of crisis, we provide emergency humanitarian relief, be it in a natural disaster or in crisis that has broken out. How can we provide that food, water, shelter, psychosocial support to communities in need? Second, we work in the development space, that poverty reduction space, specifically in the agricultural sector. How are we working with farmers to support them so that they have the skills, the tools, the resources to grow crops in the face of recurring drought, to get those crops to market, to not only support their families, but support their communities. Third, also in the development space, we work in areas like education and youth. How are we giving young people that pathway to prosperity in the educational environment, or those opportunities to pursue entrepreneurial ventures to succeed in livelihoods? And then lastly, throughout all of these spaces, but especially in the humanitarian space of late, working on capacity strengthening and really thinking about that Catholic principle of subsidiarity. Those that are closest to the problem are going to be the best position to address and solve those problems. We're working directly with local partners, many of them Catholic Caritas agencies in their countries, to give and support them as they are the direct implementers, be it of US government assistance or other funding to provide humanitarian and development assistance to populations. A couple anecdotes to just show how this works in practice. I was messaged some colleagues, hey, what are some recent things that you've seen in terms of how this actually relates on the ground? And colleagues told me about a young woman in Honduras who was thinking about migrating with her 2 children. But because she was linked up with CRS's entrepreneurial programming, she started her own business. She is making strides towards kind of building that prosperous life in her home community and no longer wants to migrate. There is another family in El Salvador that I was told about. The father had migrated to the US, lived in Colorado for 4 years, was deported back to El Salvador without economic opportunities there for him. But him and his wife started a cacao chocolate business and making chocolate. They were linked up to a program that CRS does on cacao and chocolate. And since then, they've grown this business, and they've had the original problem of not knowing whether they're going to pay the bills to now not knowing whether they're going to be able to fill all the orders that they're getting for their chocolate. This is the rootedness that we're talking about. This is the success that good investments can make. The challenge is that governments and other entities that can make these investments aren't doing it in a committed way. So that gets me to that third question. What can governments do? Now, when we think about administrations and governments, we think about pendulum swings of policy. Under the Trump administration, they cut off all funding to Central America. Under the Biden administration, they've tried to implement a root causes strategy in Central America. We cannot have pendulum swings in policy. It creates too much confusion. It doesn't kind of attack the challenges that we see of our time. We cannot ignore political crises. We cannot turn a blind eye to the impacts of climate change. That doesn't make the rain fall. That doesn't make crises go away. What we need from governments is long-term, bipartisan, congressional and administration commitment to investing in communities, to partnering with governments, to engaging at that hemispheric level, to ensure that communities and families and individuals can find opportunities in their home countries. Now, that leads me to that last question of what can we all do? Now, when I think about what we can all do, I think about the narrative question and the messaging around issues of migration. Now, my job is to engage with the US Congress, to engage with the administration, and I engage on a number of issues related to foreign aid. But a lot of the times when talking with congressional staff, they'll say, you're losing the messaging battle. Your policy may be sound, the work that you're doing is effective, but you're losing the messaging battle. And so when we think about migration, when we think about the root causes especially, how do we center our messaging on one that is related to the common good, that's focused on solidarity, that's focused on the fact that aid is both a moral good, a moral imperative, but it is also an effective use of taxpayer funding to support economic growth, to support regional and national security and stability? And how do we make sure that that message is honed in a way that it's meeting all people where they are to then produce good policy and practice? So I'll pause there, look forward to questions, and I will pass it off to Julia.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that. And a good next step in terms of laying the groundwork. Thank you, Dave, for talking about the root causes and the origin story for so many people in terms of what happens prior to arriving in the United States or striving to arrive in the United States. So as Mario mentioned, I was most recently with Jesuit Refugee Service USA, which is an international Catholic organization working specifically with refugees and other forcibly displaced persons in about 58 countries around the world, working to accompany, serve, and advocate on their behalf. I'm now currently with the Global Campaign for Education, but education has been a core part of JRS's work throughout the many years that it's existed, and is a core part of what I'm currently doing in my current role. But I want to share with everyone today is to talk a little bit about what happens for those who do feel forced to flee from their homes, who are compelled to leave their homes. What are the various options for protection here in the United States? And JRS, certainly, and other Catholic groups and other faith-based organizations around the country certainly are responding to these needs, are delivering core critical services to those who are seeking protection here in the United States. There are several opportunities, and we could spend a whole hour just on those, but I'm going to focus in specifically on the Refugee Admissions Program, also known as Refugee Resettlement. There are others, certainly, and Mario, you alluded to them, including the US government's asylum program, temporary protected status, humanitarian parole. These are all various options for various populations, depending on how they arrive in the United States, when they've arrived from the United States, from where they're arriving. There are a number of US policies that pertain to those various forms of protection. But the Refugee Admissions Program is a very unique program that is open to refugees from around the world, that coming from all kinds of countries, managed by both the US government in close partnership with the UN Refugee Agency, also known as UNHCR. And the program was developed and formalized in 1980 with the Refugee Protection Act, and has, since it was instituted in 1980, we have welcomed about 3.5 million refugees through this program. It's also been evolving over the years, very much impacted by US government policies. At the beginning in 1980, again, when the Refugee Act was passed, the number of refugees that entered into the United States was 231,000, most from South Asia. And now the program in this current fiscal year, we're at about 74,000 refugees. So I'll tell you a little bit about the evolution of the program since 1980 and where we are today, and how it's operationalized. The program itself is really directed by the president. So annually, the president makes a determination called the presidential determination and sets a cap, a goal for the number of refugees that will be admitted through the program. Congress is meant to be consulted during this process. The president and his or her administration is meant to consult with Congress. So there is a process in place to try to determine a number that makes sense for the United States. So historically, again, the number has been fairly high, has evolved over the years. Unfortunately, during the Trump administration, we saw those numbers reach an historic low. And that was in fiscal year 20, when the presidential determination was set at 18,000. And the number of refugees that arrived or were admitted into the United States in that fiscal year was around 11,000. The impact of those low numbers on the broader refugee admissions program was significant in terms of really chipping away at the infrastructure that is required to be in place to run an effective program. Since the Biden administration has assumed power, the refugee admissions program has really been working towards a rebuild and is aiming to reach the current presidential determination, which is set at 125,000 refugees for this current fiscal year. Again, as of the end of July, I think those are the latest numbers available to us. This past July, the number is 74,000 that have been admitted to the United States. The goal is 125. And I think there are aspirations and hope that we will reach that goal for this current fiscal year. But there are a number of organizations, policymakers, practitioners, implementers that are really working diligently to try to reach that goal. To give you a sense of the global scope, UN and the role that the US government plays in sort of this global goal, UNHCR annually sets a number in terms of the number of refugees that they have identified who are targets for this refugee admissions program, meaning that they estimate the number of refugees are really in need of resettlement. And these are typically highly vulnerable refugees, those who are looking to reunite with family members, for example, or they are require services that they cannot find in their host community, a variety of reasons. UNHCR estimates for 2025, so next calendar year, that there are 2.9 million refugees who are in need of resettlement. So the number that the US government is able to resettle is a drop in that bucket, but the US government still is a leader globally in terms of refugee resettlement and being able to offer this durable solution, this form of protection to refugees who are most in need. Now, I wanted to mention just a couple of new initiatives that have just been launched within the past year or so that relate to the refugee admissions program. And they fall under an umbrella called Welcome Corps, which was launched in 2023. And it's a partnership led by the US government. It's part of the US refugee admissions program. And this is a close partnership between the US government and private sponsors. And this is an effort that many advocates and practitioners have been calling for a number of years. And it's a really innovative and interesting way that the US government is trying to tackle this challenge of trying to meet the needs, the protection needs of so many refugees around the world. The idea is that private sponsors, groups of about 5 people or more, can gather together, raise some resources, and then apply for private sponsorship, apply to the US government to be able to sponsor an individual refugee or a family. To date, about 13,000 applications have been received by the US government to take part in this program. It's early days. I think we all want to wait and see what the final sort of final effect and impact of this will be, but it certainly is a new development that we want to continue to keep an eye on. 2 sub-programs initiatives that are part of this effort are Welcome Corps on Campus, which has allowed US-based universities to sponsor refugees. And I'm really excited, interestingly enough, the first cohort of students just arrived in the United States to start school this fall. The first cohort includes 30 plus refugee students who are enrolled at 17 different colleges and universities around the United States, which is really exciting to see. This provides them with a pathway to citizenship through the refugee admissions program that refugee students through other mechanisms wouldn't be able to gain. And then finally, the private sector can get involved as well. There's an initiative called Welcome Corps at Work, where employers can also sponsor refugees who they can then, of course, employ in their respective sectors. So just to say that there are a lot of interesting things happening with the refugee admissions program. Again, working alongside these other protection mechanisms that the United States offers. In terms of, I just want to highlight two final points in terms of JRS's work and the work of other Catholic and Jesuit organizations in the United States and on the border. I think there are really innovative things happening as well. While JRS itself is not a resettlement agency, JRS does have an office in El Paso, Texas, working binationally in the United States and Mexico, serving migrants and asylum seekers through legal representation and mental health and psychosocial support services. There are other Jesuit efforts as well. Many of you may have heard of the Keno Border Initiative in Nogales, Arizona. There's a fairly new initiative called the Del Camino Border Ministry in Brownsville, Texas. So there's a lot of interest and momentum and support for engagement on the border. But overall, just to wrap up, the narrative and the messaging that I know, Dave, you talked about, and I think we all want to discuss a bit further, is something that we all struggle with as we try to advocate for pro-refugee and pro-asylum policies, for example. We want to humanize these stories, these individuals, rather than getting caught up in a rhetoric that becomes very partisan and complicated. I think David made a good point that a lot of these policies can get wrapped up in complicated mechanisms that are hard for advocates to comprehend, and certainly those on the receiving end to comprehend. So by humanizing these stories, really talking about the needs and the services for those who are seeking protection here in the United States, I think we can make some headway. But for now, those of us who are operating in this space and those of you participating and listening who are interested in supporting this work, we need, I think, everyone to join in and to take part in these conversations and to take action in terms of making the case for why these kinds of programs need to continue and be sustained over time. So I will wrap up there to give others time to speak. I'll hand things over to Mark.
Great, thank you very much. I wanted to share my slides and wonder if I might be able to have that turned on. And while I'm waiting for that to get turned on, my name is Mark Lopez, and I'm the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the Pew Research Center. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization based in Washington, and our purpose is to provide information to the public about all kinds of things, including demography, public opinion, and also the views the public has generally of groups like immigrants. So I'm going to try to share with you some of that work, and let me see if I can share my slides. Here we go. Hope you're as excited as I am about this. Happy to also make my slides available to folks after the presentation. Mario, I will mail you a PDF that you could post if you'd like to. So lots to talk about. Let me just immediately get right to it, because I think one of the big stories about immigration in the United States today is that we're approaching a moment where we're going to match the historic peak that we saw in the 1890s in the share of the US population that was born in another country. Now, these are people who are born outside the United States and are not born to US citizen parents, because as you know, there are many people who are Americans who are also born to US citizen parents on military bases, et cetera. But this number is now approaching almost 14%. We were at a peak of 14.8% back in 1890. And today we have about 46 million plus people who are immigrants living in the US today. Again, it's important to note how big of a change we've seen, at least since 1965. And you see here I have a number for 1970 where the share of the US population that were immigrants was at 4.7%. That was a low point. But 65 is important because it was a year where the US Congress passed a law, the Immigration and Nationality Act, that changed a lot about immigration and ultimately the demography of the country. And I want to talk a little bit about that. One other big point to remember or to be aware of: there may be 46 million immigrants living in the US today, but did you know that 72 million immigrants have come to the US since 1965? Not everybody has stayed. Some have returned home. Not everybody is still alive. Many have passed away. But today we have 46 million, but in total, about 72 million people have come to the country since 1965, with half from Latin America alone and a quarter from Asia, which is a very different migration story than would have been the case with previous waves of immigrants to the United States. Of course, today's immigrant population has many different characteristics, but one characteristic I want to be very clear about is their status. Here, we oftentimes talk about immigrants are in the country illegally. And a lot of the focus is on what happens at the US-Mexico border, as Dave was saying a little bit earlier, and a lot of focus particularly on Mexican migration. But today, 3/4 of US immigrants are in the country legally. Half are naturalized US citizens, and many are here on some sort of either here legally or on some sort of temporary legal reason. But when you take a look at the population overall, it is largely a legal immigrant population. Now, about 23% are people who are in the country with what we say without authorization or who are undocumented immigrants. And that's oftentimes been the focus of both public opinion and policy here in the United States over the course of the last 5 decades or so. So what is this? What is happening with that particular population? Well, our most recent estimates from the Pew Research Center indicate that this population of unauthorized immigrants, people who are in the country without authorization, is starting to grow again after a significant amount of time being in decline. So we reached a peak in 2007 of about 12.2 million unauthorized immigrants living in the US then. Back then they made up about 28% of the immigrant population in the country. So about this, not much different than what we are today in terms of share of the immigrant population. But over the course of the last few years, we've seen an uptick in the number of unauthorized immigrants living in the country, so much so that we're now at about 11 million by 2022. And I want to highlight that a lot's happened since 2022, so this number is probably higher as well. But nonetheless, we had already started to see some sort of an uptick in the number of unauthorized immigrants living in the country. But here's one of the real kickers. Who are unauthorized immigrants today? Interestingly, Mexicans used to be the big story of unauthorized immigrants. They made up more than half of unauthorized immigrants, but today they do not. And in fact, a lot of the decline in the unauthorized immigrant population has come from a decline in the Mexican unauthorized immigrant population. People who may have returned home, people whose status may have changed. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why that number is in decline. Well, look at how sharply that has happened since 2007, from nearly 7 million unauthorized Mexican immigrants in the US to 4 million in 2022. What's happened? Well, a lot of people from other countries have entered into an unauthorized immigrant status. And notice how I said that. This is not just about people crossing the border, but also people whose status may have changed here in the US. So you might be, for example, an immigrant from India or China on a particular visa that expires, but then you fall into an unauthorized immigrant status. And that's one of the things that we're seeing here, is that people entering this are not just people who cross the border, but people who are also seeing their status expire and therefore becoming unauthorized as a result. Now, that's just one part of the story of immigration in the United States. I want to talk a little bit more about who are the nation's immigrants. This chart shows you the 5 largest immigrant origin groups in the country today. Mexicans, despite the decline in their population, is the nation's largest single immigrant group at about 10.6 million. By the way, the number peaked at around 12 million or so, 12.5 million or so a couple of years ago. They make up 23% of all immigrants. About a quarter of all immigrants living in the country today, a quarter of that 46 million, are from Mexico. India and China are number 2 and number 3, both very close in size, both under 3 million. The Philippines is at 2 million, and El Salvador has about 1.4 million immigrants here living in the United States today. Again, a lot of diversity in those origin countries. And if I were to extend this down to the top 10, you would see other countries like the Dominican Republic, Korea, Vietnam being in that list, all either countries in Latin America or in Asia in the top 10 immigrant populations living in the country. But that masks a lot of growing diversity. Many immigrants today also come from places like Africa. And in fact, among the nation's Black population, about 10% of all Black Americans today are immigrants. That's a number that's grown from about 4% back in 2000. So they give you some sense that this is a story not just of Latin America and Asia, but other places as well. You can also see this diversity in other ways. As you know, back in the early 20th century, the country was pretty diverse in terms of its immigrant population, with many people tracing their roots to Europe. This chart shows you, or this map shows you, the largest immigrant group in each state in 1920. So you can see Germans, you can see Russians, you can see Mexicans, you see Italians, Norwegians, Canadians, a lot of diversity across the states in terms of who the largest immigrant group was in each state. Here's the story for today. Today, in most states, Mexican immigrants are the single largest group, reflecting their large presence among all immigrants across the country. But there's also some really interesting diversity across the country. Did you know in South Dakota that Guatemalan immigrants are the single largest immigrant group in the state of South Dakota? And did you know that in Louisiana, it's people from Honduras? And if you look in the Northeast, you'll see there's quite a wide diversity of places. For those of you who are from the Washington, D.C. area, Salvadorans have long been the single largest immigrant group in the District of Columbia. Well, that's no longer the case. It's now Ethiopians. So this diversity of change, I think, is really an important part of the story of our nation's immigrant population. So what about the impact of immigration on U.S. demography? Here I'm going to show you some older charts, which are based on population projections. So I admit that these are probably out of date now, but I think they get the point across pretty well about what's happened since 1965. First, without immigration, the U.S. population would have grown much more slowly. And in fact, looking forward to 2065, 100 years after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, without immigration, the U.S. population will probably start to decline relatively soon. I can't underestimate the importance of immigrants and immigration to the nation's population and demography story. Immigrants are an important driver of U.S. population growth. So it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. In fact, I should say immigrants and their children. It's important to keep that in mind. Also, with the changing origins of immigrants, it's really interesting to see how the racial and ethnic composition of the country has also changed. Here's where we were from 1900 to 1965. Largely a black-white country, 84% white in 1965, 11% black, with some Hispanic and Asian population, but nothing like we have today. If you go to 2015, so 50 years after 1965, you could see that by 2015, 62% of the nation's population was white and non-Hispanic, 12% black, 18% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. That Hispanic number today, by the way, is now at almost 20%. So nearly 1 in 5 Americans today are Hispanic. But look at how the diversity of the country has changed just so quickly over the course of 5 decades. Also, if you take a look at the distribution of race and ethnicity in 2015 across different age groups, you could also see that the nation's youth are more diverse racially and ethnically than older populations of Americans, again, reflecting the relatively recent arrival of many immigrant groups to the country and also their offspring now entering adulthood and also having children as well. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics here when it comes to the nation's demography. I want to finish by talking about the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border, again, just to give you some trends. So this is through December of 2023, and if I had extended this all the way to today, you would have seen these numbers drop precipitously since December 2023. But as you know, there's been an awful lot of conversation about the number of people crossing the U.S.-Mexico border and presenting themselves to the Border Patrol for protections. That has been a big part of the story over the course of the last year and a half, and this is something that you hear Donald Trump make a lot of comments about as Kamala Harris and the Biden administration not having done a good job at managing the border. So we've asked the U.S. public, what do they think about the job the U.S. government is doing at the U.S.-Mexico border? And it's a question we've asked for many years. And here, I think there's one big important thing to know, actually 2 big important things to know. The first is fewer Americans say the U.S. government is doing a good job. The share that say it's doing a bad job is now up to 80%, and that's either a somewhat or a very bad job, and 18% say that it's a very good or somewhat good job. Among Republicans, perhaps no surprise, you can see the partisanship here. When Trump was president, 55% of Republicans said, oh, the government's doing a good job. When Biden became president, more than 85% were saying that the U.S. government was doing a bad job dealing with the large number of migrants seeking to enter the U.S. at the U.S.-Mexico border. But look at the story for Democrats. Democrats have turned sour on the job that the U.S. government is doing at handling the number of people arriving at the border, at least through January of 2024. And you can see here that 73% in our January survey said that the U.S. government is doing an either somewhat or very bad job at managing the number of people coming to the border at the U.S.-Mexico border. Only 26% say it's a good job. But again, it's a shift in viewpoint since 2021. I think it's important to keep in mind, particularly given the conversation about immigration in today's election. And then finally, I wanted to share with you one last piece here. I know there's a lot here in this chart, and my apologies, but we asked the U.S. public, what do you think would make things better at the border? What could improve the situation? The number one thing that the public said could improve the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border was to have more the judges and staff that can process asylum applications. 60% said that that would make things better. 56% said creating more opportunities for people to legally immigrate to the US would also make things better. And 52% said increasing deportations of people who are in the country illegally would make things better. So it's a mix of reactions, and I can let you all take a look at this, and we can go all the way down. I might point out one other one. 41% say substantially expanding the wall along the US-Mexico border would make things better. 32% say that it would not make much difference. And 14% say it would make things worse. I'm going to stop there because that was a lot to share with you, and I look forward to our conversation. But I think that gives you a good sense of sort of where we are today in terms of both the importance of immigration to the nation's demography, but also how the public sees immigration today. Now, actually, one last thing. When you ask the US public about top issues today, you'll find that among Trump supporters, immigration usually is ranking in the top 3 to 5 issues. For Harris supporters or Biden supporters, it's usually much lower on the list. In fact, pretty far down the list as a top issue. So Democrats and Republicans see the issue of immigration differently for this year's election cycle. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Luz, if you will unmute yourself. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so thanks so much, Mark. And let me just begin with an apology to those of you who can see me close up. I have a bruised face. I had a bad jogging fall over the weekend, nothing to do with the wrestling match that Mario and I have about how much time I'm going to get to speak. My name is Mus Chishti. I'm a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, which is a DC-based think tank. I just focus on U.S. Immigration policy, though the institute looks at immigration worldwide. And before I came to MPI, I was a lawyer in the American labor movement. So we have very little time left. And with the 7 minutes Mario assigned me, I told him that that's sort of giving me time to give an elevator pitch on immigration. Luckily, my elevator pitches on immigration have become shorter and shorter. And that tells you how crystallized in many ways our immigration policy dilemma has become. I happen to think that the country has 2 challenges on immigration. One, we have outdated immigration selection system. And 2, we have a border crisis. And the 2 are, in my mind, twin crises, but they're interrelated. Let me just spell out one after the other. I think Mark's presentation was the right backdrop to what I'm about to say first, is that we have a demographic crisis in our country. Baby boomers are retiring at a rate of 10,000 a day. We will soon have more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18, which demographers tell is going to be a major milestone. And that creates a huge challenge in the labor market. And you would say, well, immigration is a solution to the problems of the labor market and the problems of demography. And this is sort of where we get into how our selection system of picking immigrants is designed. I never get tired of saying that we have an immigration selection system which is based on a 1952 architecture, which has been tweaked and tinkered with only 2 or 3 times since. The last time it was even touched was in 1990. Now, that doesn't make sense to anyone. That doesn't make sense even to an AOC supporter or to a Trump supporter. And if you look at how within that selection system, how its dysfunction is manifesting itself on a daily basis, is sort of what was reflected in your number 2 finding, Mark, towards the end, that 56% of Americans think we should create more pathways for legal immigrants. So that our viewers don't feel alarmed, we haven't become a fortress America. We haven't become a restrictionist country. I mean, we have been allowing 1 million people a year to come as lawful permanent residents for this whole 21st century. And that did not change much even in the Trump COVID era. We can now say, I think, quite legitimately that we have returned to pre-Trump, pre-COVID patterns of migration in our country, where more than 1 million people are allowed to come on as lawful permanent residents. What is problem is the base is under which people are allowed to come. Today, among the 1 million people, only 7% of those 1 million people are actually admitted on the basis of demonstrated labor market need of our country. Now, some of you will quickly point out that no, it's like 15% is employment based, but when you look at it, 15%, half of that are families of the principal immigrants. So in terms of actual immigrants, it's 7%. And to make it more sharp, if you're not a high-skilled immigrant, typically in the H-1B category, there is almost no way for you to get a green card for a labor market need in our country. So it's highly skewed towards high immigrants, and even that at a very small number. So we at the Migration Policy Institute have for some time been suggesting that the way to address this is to have a new selection system, which we call the bridge visa, which would sort of bridge occupations from low and middle to high skill on one hand, and bridge temporariness and permanence. Because it's kind of a joke to tell someone, you're an H-1B temporary worker and you're a temporary worker for 21 years. We're just committing fraud on ourselves and on the American people. Under our suggestion for a bridge visa, we would allow people to be sponsored by an employer for a particular job for which we would test the U.S. labor market, so U.S. workers and working conditions are not undermined. They would be admitted for a period of 3 years. At the end of 3 years, they would have a choice. You may want to return to Salvador. You may want to return to Guatemala, because we think increasingly not everyone wants to retire in the United States. Not everyone wants to die in the United States. That even low-skilled migrants can have the aspiration to live in more than one place in the course of their life. So they will be allowed to go back. They can apply for a bridge visa a few years down the line. But you can, if you don't want to go back after 3 years, you can extend it by 6 years. At the end of 6 years, you have to make up your mind. So, but this encourages circularity of migration, which our current system does not allow. And then to determine how many people do we allow to come in on bridge visa, we think the number right now should be set at least at 250,000 a year. But that number should not be static. That number should be determined every 2 years by an independent body akin to the Federal Reserve, which is not a decision made by politicians, but a decision made by people who have real expertise in labor market characteristics of the country. And that number that they assign becomes the number for the following 2 years. So that may change, and of course, that may go down in a recessionary time and may go up in an expansion time. So circularity and flexibility are the two hallmarks of the proposal that we have made in the bridge visa concept. Now, this is not happening. In fact, nothing on legal immigration reform is happening because of the other crisis, which is the border. And Mark in his graph highlighted it the most. And Trump showed similar graphs at the assassination attempt on him in Pennsylvania. We know that we have reached a new era of mass migration at the border. I think the Biden administration will be known as sort of one of the largest chapters of migration at the border to our country. But almost it's very different than the border crisis we had a few years ago. In fact, I would say that our current border policy, which is in terms of the laws, regulations, the staffing, and the resources we have at the border, is written for a 2008 border challenge, when it was single Mexican men trying to cross their border incandescently and hoping not to get detected. That's not the reality of the border today. More and more non-Mexicans are coming, more and more family units are coming, and almost all of them are showing at the border saying we're here seeking asylum. So walls are not going to solve that problem. So if they all seeking asylum, then we have what has become an asylum crisis. So you could argue actually that the border crisis is not a crisis of numbers at the border, it's an asylum crisis. That we have 3.7 million people in the backlogs of our immigration court system where asylum cases are heard. To add more cases to that huge backlog is, to me, definition of insanity. So we have argued at the MPI that we should have a reformed asylum system, at least for asylum seekers at the border. The new asylum seekers coming to the border, their cases after the credible fear determination, when they are sent inside the country, should not be sent to an immigration judge, but they should be sent to an asylum officer. And if you have asylum cases heard in an asylum office, we think those cases can be finished, including an appeal, within the course of 1 year. Then we will have certain sanity left where all can feel that we have a fair and a fast method of determining asylum. And people who make it are integrated quickly into the society. People who don't make it will be removed. That's the kind of definitiveness and certainty that we need in our asylum system. The lack of it has created the magnet for people to come to the United States who may actually not be eligible for asylum. So we should have a system which actually does grant asylum quickly to people who deserve it and doesn't allow people who don't deserve it to game it. So if we have this we call the asylum rule system, it's actually a rule was implemented. It was by the administration on it. It just has not been put in place robustly. And we think if we have that rule in place, we will have a more streamlined asylum system in which we can all have faith. So these are the two twin challenges, and these are our twin solutions for these two challenges. Thank you, Mario. Back to you.
Thank you, Muth and Mark, Julia, and David. Thank you very, very much for your respective syntheses of such incredibly complex both programs, issues, and solutions. I want to jump quickly to questions that, to the extent that we have a little bit of time. And Lois from the Bronx asked a good question, which I will sort of frame and then give a little bit more substance to for each of you to answer. But I think it's kind of the question of the day to some extent. And she says, I agree on the messaging problem or failure. What are the suggestions? And I would simply say this to add to Lois's question, which is, right, David, you've talked about the appropriation of funds. I think at some point in time you reflected that for some folks on Congress, money spent can be seen as money lost. Though there's this moral imperative and a rational positive result to investing in our neighbors and in other countries. So the question again, why is this not working? If we can agree that it's not, or is there a messaging problem? Julie, I would say likewise, right? We have this refugee resettlement system in place. Yes, it may receive 125,000, yet does it get to the question of the 3.8 million or others who are being forced into an asylum system, which is under-resourced, it's old, and it's not really built for purpose in a sense. And I guess related to that, Mark, that question of messaging, interestingly, that folks feel that we need more judges, but is that right at sort of kind of the definition of insanity? We put in more judges, but they continue to get more new cases. I think CMS has done a study recently that looked at effectively, each year there's some 700,000 more cases and 300,000 are adjudicated. So it's just a system that can't keep up to itself, which maybe creates, again, a dysfunctional machine, though we understand that structurally that is potentially a solution. But I would say, where does the messaging fail in this? And what are the solutions that we can give to folks like Lois and others on this call who do service day to day, who are in communities, who are engaged with people who maybe support these ideas and maybe don't? Maybe I'll just turn it to each of you sequentially. David, starting with you.
Yeah, and I'll go quickly. Lois, good to see you virtually. I know Lois did advocacy on a lot of these issues when she was a campus minister. But I just think we have a problem of information, a problem of interests, and a problem of partisanship. What do I mean by that? The right information is not getting to everybody to truly understand what are the challenges we're facing and what are the opportunities and policy solutions. So there's an information problem. There's an interest problem where I think as a collective whole, our country sees policy solutions as zero sum. We've lost the idea that interests as a nation can be nuanced and that we can have humane immigration reform and interests aligned on national security, economic opportunity, and moral imperative. And then third, this issue of partisanship, which is kind of the reason we have these two information and interest challenges, is that there is just incredible partisanship here in Washington. And this is going to take the solution, the suggestion is for human connection at a real sense, and for bravery around advancing just policy, where people can stand in front of constituents who may have incorrect information or who may have different aligned interests to say, no, this is for the betterment of our society as a whole, and this is how we can move things forward. Less than 1% of the US government budget goes to foreign aid. But you ask someone, they most likely think it's a quarter of our budget, less than 1%. So we need to do better at information, aligning interests, and reducing partisanship.
And I'll add that I mentioned earlier the importance of humanizing these issues and telling these stories. I'll just add that one way of doing that as advocates here in the United States is to speak out on these issues directly with their policymakers. At JRS, we would host an annual advocacy day that had a tremendous impact, not only on the policymakers that received the information from their constituents, but on the constituent themselves, being able to empower themselves and play that role of voice, being that voice for those who otherwise won't necessarily have that opportunity to convey these kinds of messages. So I would say, in terms of a suggestion, empower yourselves with these messages and deliver them, because just that process of delivering those messages and speaking out on behalf of these individuals and these stories and these issues has a tremendous impact. And so just that simple action could really make a tremendous difference.
That's reassuring. And Mark, before you jump in there, let me just add one thing I read recently in a Fox poll that asked 5 questions to survey. And questions 2 and 4 were very interesting to me. Question 2 said, should people who are here illegally be deported? And 67% of respondents said yes. And then question 4 was, should people who are here illegally but are working have a pathway to citizenship, essentially? And 62% said yes. Now, I'll read those as being essentially the same percentage, but they're saying different things about the same people. And I'm curious to know, right, there still seems like almost like a psychic divide. On the one hand, this is the idea of the rule of law enforcement, but then this is the idea that, well, no, if people are working, there's maybe a mixture of compassion, reason, rationality, and pragmatism that say, no, that's appropriate for someone like that to stay. Messaging, just curious to know how you'd answer that in context of the other questions.
Wow. So there's a lot there. So first I would say, the Pew Research Center, we're not advocacy, and we don't make any recommendations for policies. It's not even on messaging. But I would say that what we've talked about here does indicate that for the public, the public has some pretty strong views about the impact of immigrants in the United States. On the one hand, our surveys have found that many Americans see immigrants as making the country stronger and better, though it's mostly Democrats who say that. And when it comes to crime, the public continues to say that immigrants, particularly unauthorized immigrants, lead to more crime. And many Americans feel that immigrants negatively impact their lives. I think we have to take all that into account when we think about how we talk to the public about this, because much of the public, a significant share, I should say, has a strong point of view that immigrants are not necessarily good for the country. Maybe that's the result of messaging from another side. Maybe that's the result of some real life experiences. Maybe that's the result of having lost a job, for example. Whatever it is, there is, I think, a significant challenge here if you're trying to change the way in which the public sees immigrants and immigrations. I also don't know if it's necessarily the case that one can say with certainty that more immigration will make the country a better place. Not sure that most Americans would agree with that. But I do think if you're going to make that case, you have to make a pretty strong case without sounding condescending, without sounding like we know better, and without sounding like we owe this to the rest of the world, because I don't think that will resonate with some parts of the American public. Nonetheless, our surveys show so many different things, and like you said, Mario, the way you ask the question can have an impact on the sort of answers that you get. But I do think that there are some emerging consensus around the public's views, particularly when it comes to immigrants and crime and immigrants' impact on the economy. I think a large part of the U.S. public sees that as negative impacts. But all that is just to say that not to recommend anything, but I think we need to be aware of these dynamics that are happening out there with regards to immigration attitudes.
Thank you. And Moose, before I get to you, since we are out of time, if not over time, and I do want to respect this, there are a couple of questions that were asked that relate to availability of this presentation, some of the PowerPoint, that I think some of you, Mark and Julia and David, may have already answered, but we will make this recording available on the website and also redistribute it to those who registered for this. But Moose, the last word to you, messaging. And your audio.
Messaging is very complicated, but my sense about this is that in terms of people's feeling about generally that immigrants commit more crime, immigrants are coming in this illegal, nefarious way. I think for a long time we used to think this is a highly polarized debate in political. But now, as Mark's own numbers at the end show, it's becoming much less so. There is much more convergence now, just in the last 3 years, between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on their views on immigration. This tells you how quickly this can change. So I'm not waving the red flag on this, but I happen to think that this recent chapter on immigration will have long-term impact on perceptions of immigrants and about immigration policy. And we'll have to live with it. And this first sense is that there's a sense of disorder. Americans are generous towards immigration. They don't like disorder. That it's a managed, orderly immigration, there's a lot of support for. The moment it looks disorderly, all kinds of imagery, I think, then comes up to the fore. So therefore, that's why bringing order to this in terms of more streamlined processing at the border, I think goes a long way. The second thing from my perspective, what works is not talking about immigration in abstract terms, but immigrants in people's lives. That when you tell someone, just look at the food that you're eating, that is it's impossible that what you're eating has not been touched by someone who's an immigrant. The COVID showed that in sharp focus, that people who are harvesting our crops, processing our crops, cooking our food, delivering our food so that we could sit comfortably in the comfort of our home was almost all made possible by immigrants. When people hear that, they can perceive it. The last point I made, which we didn't get to talk about today, is the role of immigrants in our social security system. Everyone knows that our social security system is under challenge. It may go bankrupt. The only way it can be saved is by young, active workers contributing to it. That's not coming from, as Mark's presentation showed, come from native-born people. It's increasingly going to rely on foreign workers. If you're really concerned about your social security benefits coming in the next 20, 30 years of your parents and grandparents, the key to that is to have a stable flow of immigrants entering our labor market.
Thank you, Moose. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mark, David, Julia, very, very much for your comments. I wish we could do this for another 45 minutes or an hour, and maybe we will one day, but I think this is a terrific sort of setting of the issues and the problems, the truth and the realities, and most profoundly, I think, perceptions, which we are understanding, of course, as a group here. That is what we struggle with a lot, is question: how do we speak? How do we tell the story? Is it a question of encounter? And this is a question of language, security versus management, right? Security versus pathways. So a job to be continued, with gratitude to you for what you do, for those of you on this call, and for those of you who will see on Thursday of next week. Thank you again. Much appreciated.